What is the Maddox rod? It is a glass or plastic rod that converts the image of a light source into a streak of light perpendicular to the rod's axis. The position of the light in relation to the image of the light source indicates the presence and amount of heterophoria. It is based on the principle of diplopic perception. Indications for use: to detect small, latent and manifest deviations as well as torsion, small to moderate vertical deviations where simultaneous perception and normal retinal correspondence is present, and decompensated phorias.
Tammy?
Yep.
Hi Tammy, how are you going? My name's Yumna, I'll be your student of doctors. Would you like to come through? Grab a seat.
After confirming the patient's details and a thorough history taking, we begin testing the Maddox rod. The equipment you will need include a Maddox rod or a trial frame with a Maddox lens, a light source and a prism bar. In order to perform this test accurately, the lights in the room should be dimmed. First, determine whether you are going to measure the deviation at near or in the distance. We are going to start with measuring the deviation at near. The next step is to determine whether you are going to measure the horizontal or vertical deviation in order to place a Maddox rod in the correct orientation. Let's start with measuring the horizontal deviation. When measuring the horizontal deviation, the cylindrical striations are placed horizontally in front of the patient's eye and a torch is placed directly in front of the patient a third of the meter away.
Can you see the light in the red torch?
Yes.
And where is the line in relation to the torch?
It's on the left-hand side.
Left-hand side?
Yep.
With this example, the patient states that they see the red line on the left side of the torch. This indicates that the patient's eye is crossed and thus the patient has an exodeviation. In order to measure the size of the deviation, you would then introduce a prism bar in front of the patient. The prism bar is placed on the same eye as the Maddox rod. In this instance, you will get the patient to hold the Maddox rod in order for the examiner to freely move the prism bar. In this example, as the patient states the image is crossed, the prism bar will be placed with its base in.
Are you able to hold this for me?
Oh, yes, sure.
Awesome. I'm just going to hold it just there for me. Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to be placing this prism bar in front of your eye. Just want you to let me know when that line superimposes the light for me, or when they're over each other.
Here.
Yeah?
Yep.
Yeah.
At this point, the patient indicates that the line superimposes the torch when the prism bar is at 10 prism diopters base in. Now we are going to measure the vertical deviation. With the vertical deviation, the Maddox rod is going to be placed with the striations positioned vertically. Similar to determining the horizontal deviation, we are going to simply ask the patient the same instructions.
Alright, and where do you see that line now in relation to the light?
It's on the top now.
It's on the top?
Yep.
Yep.
In this example, the patient indicates that the red line is above the torch. This means that the patient's image is situated higher and thus the patient has a hypodeviation. In order to measure this hypodeviation, the prism bar is going to be placed with its base up.
And can you just hold this for me? Awesome. Just going to hold it right there. So just want you to let me know again when that line is over the top of the light for me.
Here.
Yeah?
Yep.
Yeah?
The patient indicated that the light source and red line is superimposed when the prism bar is at 4 prism diopters base up. Now let's have a look at the complete results. For the horizontal deviation that was measured first, the patient has an exodeviation of 10 prism diopters base in and a hypodeviation of 4 prism diopters base up. Now, so far, we have only demonstrated how to measure the deviation at near. This test can also be measured in the distance at 6 meters using a light source in the distance. The same exact instructions will be administered to the patient, however, this time a handheld light source is not required. Other results that can be obtained in this test include the patient seeing the light already superimposed over the line, indicating the patient has binocular single vision, The patient sees a line to the right of the light, indicating the patient sees an uncrossed image and thus has an ESO deviation, and the patient sees a line is below the light, depicting the patient has a hyperdeviation. Advantages of the Maddox Rod test. The test can be easily performed. It is a subjective test. It is simple and fast, can be used on children, and can be used to measure torsional and cyclodeviations. Disadvantages of the test. In order to perform the test, the patient must have normal retinal correspondence. The test cannot be performed on a patient with suppression. It cannot be performed if the patient has sensory anomalies. The test is unable to distinguish if the deviation is manifest or latent. Not suitable for large deviations, and it is a subjective test. Therefore, we are relying on the patient's response, and hence there is a potential that the result is unreliable. Here are some tips and tricks to help you perform the Maddox Rod. Get the patient to hold the Maddox Rod to allow yourself to record the results easier. Write out the basic recording results possible before conducting the test to save time, and if confused, request the patient to draw out what they see. Lastly, ensure that the rod is at either 90 or 180 degrees to avoid the patient relaying a torsion result. Ensure that the assessor records the result as the patient sees it to avoid confusion, and remember that the line is perpendicular to the orientation of the rod striations.